So let's see this particular question. So in this question, we are given two tables. One is the visits table, another one is the transactions table. Now, what the visits table hold is that it holds the visit information of any user to a given bank on any particular day, right? So it has records like user ID and visit date. So which user on what date, which is the visit date, made a visit to a particular given bank, right? So that's what the visit table holds. And with every visit, any given user can actually make one or more transactions in the bank, right? And all that transaction information is given in the transaction table, right? So which user on which particular date made how much amounts transaction, right? And whenever they are making a transaction on a given date, obviously they would have visited the bank first to make a transaction, and that's why for that particular date, for that particular user, definitely you will get a record in the visits table, right? But the reverse is not true. There might be some users who visited the bank but did not make any transactions, right? So for those users, you will find a record over here for that particular date, but you won't find a record for those users for the corresponding date over here, right? So that's the entire information that is given. Now what we need to do is we need to write a solution to find how many users visited the bank and didn't do any transactions, how many visited the bank and did one transaction, and so on, right? So basically the result table will contain these two columns. It will have the transactions count, which is the number of transactions done in one visit, right? And visits count, which is the corresponding number of users who did that transactions count in one visit to the bank, right? And transactions count should basically take all the values to from 0 to maximum transactions count done by one or more users, right? So what the question means is that we need to find, all the possible values of the transaction count that were done in a single visit by any user, right? It can be done by just one user in one of their visit, or it can be done by multiple users in multiple, like in their corresponding visits. But then we have to find the values of the all the possible transaction counts that were done in a single visit by one or more users, right? And then we need to find for every possible transaction count that we just found, how many users actually did those many number of transactions in a single visit, right? How many times that particular transaction count number of transactions were done in a single visit by any user, right? So for every possible transaction count, we have to find that number, right? And also, it is possible that, as we said, that a user might visit the bank but do no transaction. So in that particular case, the transaction count for such visits, wherein there is no record over here in the transactions table, but there is a record in the visits table, the transaction count in such visits would be 0, right? And again, like taking the visits count of such transactions would just mean how many visits were such which ended up in no transactions over here by any user, right? So that's what we want to do over here. Now, maybe you can just pause this video and try to read this particular question on your own. It's a long descriptive question, so just maybe try to uh, kind of understand it on your own once, and then try to also write a query for this. Once you are done, you can just come over here and check the solution, right? So now, since we first need to find, all the possible values of the transaction count for any user done on any particular visit, what we can do is we can first group on user ID and the visit date, right? So first of all, we will have to like left join visits table with the transactions table, just to like mark those particular records and also include those particular records in our transactions, which I mean where the transaction count is 0, right? So basically those records which are present in the visits table but are not present in the transactions table, right? So for those visits, we will have to mark the transaction count to 0. And so we can just left join this table with this table and identify such records, right? Where there is no transaction, and happily mark the transaction count 0 for them, right? So what we can do is we can just group by on the user ID and the visit date, first of all, right? And we can take the total transaction count, right, for every visit, right? For example, if you talk about user ID 1 with visit date 1/1/2020, for this particular transaction date, for user ID 1, there is no record actually, right? So the transaction count for this particular visit will be 0, right? Similarly, if you see this particular record, user ID 2 and visit date 3rd of Jan, you will see one record over here, right? So for this particular visit, the total transaction count will be 1, right? And like for every visit, we can find the total transaction count, right? And then once we have the transaction count for every user ID and the visit date, now we can reverse group by on the transaction count, right? Because whatever transaction counts we got, those are basically the possible values of the transaction counts that we have in this particular data, right? So now we can just group by on the transaction count, and for each of the transaction count, now we can find how many times that transaction count was actually uh, done by any user in any of their visits, right? So we can just group by on the transaction count and find the count of the users, right? So that will give us the visits count, right, for every transaction count. So that is the approach. And now also, like, one thing more we will have to take care of, that like in the transaction counts should be consecutive series of numbers from 0 till the maximum transaction count that we have found, which is possible from this particular data, right? There should be no holes in the sequence, right? So for example, if you see for transaction count 2, the visit count is 0, right? So there was like no user who on any given visit date did two number of transactions, right? So that's why for transaction count 2, the visits count is 0, right? But we still have to include this transaction count 2 record in our result set with visit count 0, right? So we will have to take care of it. We cannot just skip this particular transaction count. We will need to include it in our result, right? So we will have to like take care of that in the solution. So maybe let's jump to the IDE now and write a solution for this particular problem. All right, so now let's write the query that we just discussed to solve this particular question. So now, first of all, what we will do is we will combine the visits table and the transactions table by doing a left join between them, right? So now I will do a left join between the visits and the transactions table like this. And my joining condition would be on a dot user ID equal to b dot user ID, right? And also a dot visit date is equal to b dot. Okay, I need to alias this first, only then it will show in the IntelliSense. Yeah, b dot transaction date, right? Now what I can do is I can group by visit date and the user ID, so that for every visit made by any user, I will be able to count the total transactions that they did, right? So for that, let me just group by, uh, you know, visit date, comma, a dot user ID, right? And I can also select these two columns in my select statement here, right? And then I can simply take count of b dot user ID, which is coming from the transactions table actually, right? And I can call it as the transactions count, something like that, this, right? Transactions count or transaction count, anything is fine. So now if I run this, you will see the output over here, right? So now for every visit date done by any user ID, we got what was the total transaction count done in that particular visit, right? And wherever there was like no transaction record in the transactions table for a given visit, we would have got null in the b.user ID column. Why? Because we have done a left join. And so for all the missing values in the right table, which is the transactions table, I would have got null for all the columns, right? So that's why when I'm doing a count of b.user ID, which is coming from my right table, it would have got count of null, which would have been treated as a 0, right? And that's why I got transaction count as 0, right? That's the purpose of left joining and then doing this group by to find the transaction count. And now what I need to do is I need to group by all the transactions count and see how many times they occurred in this particular result, right? Because that will give me the number of times these many number of like each of these number of transactions were done in any of the visits by any user, any single visit, right? So what I can do is I can capture the result of this particular query in a CT, maybe call it as CT transaction, maybe transaction count, right? And then what I will be doing is now I can just group by the transaction count, right? So I can say CT transaction count and I can just group by transaction count, right? And I can select this over here. And I can simply take a count of user ID now, right? To know how many visits are such which have each of these transaction count of number of transactions done in that visit, right? So this can be my visits count, right? Right. And now if I run this, so now this will give me all the possible values which are present for my transaction count, right? How many visits are such in which each of these transaction count number of transactions were done, right? For example, there are four such visits by any user in which in each of these visits there were zero transactions done, right? There are five such visits in which each of these visits there were one transactions which were done. And similarly, there were three transactions done for just one such visit by a given user, right? So that's the output. But now what we also have to take care of that any missing transaction count in the entire series from zero till the maximum transaction count possible, we don't need to have any kind of holes, right? We cannot have holes in the entire sequence from zero till the maximum transaction count. So we will have to take care of that. And how to actually take care of that is we can actually generate, a sequence of numbers starting from zero till the maximum transaction count possible, right? And then we can left join with that particular table. This result set, we can just left join with that particular series of number and take the, that series that we have generated as the transaction count, right? And if there is no transaction count available in this particular result set for any given number in that series, I will have the visits count equal to zero, right? So that's how I can make use of the left join again after generating a series of numbers, right? And how to actually generate a series of numbers? We can make use of a recursive CTE over here, right? To generate a series of numbers. And if you want to like understand how a CTE or recursive CTE works, we anyways are going to talk about it now. But if you want to like go into the depth of the recursive CTEs, how they work and how to make use of them, there is a separate video that I have made while I was solving another question, a very detailed one. I will just link it over here in this video on the top right corner, and you can just go and have a look at that video if you have any doubts, right? So now what we will do is maybe what we can do, we can just take this particular result set in another CT and call it as temp results, right? Because these are sort of our results and we still need to do some kind of processing on top of it. So now I can just declare another CT, right? Now what I need to do is I need to generate that sequence, right? But to generate that sequence, I will have to first capture the maximum transaction count which is possible from this particular result set, right? And I will show you why do we need that, because actually we would be using that as the the limit till which we have to like generate the sequence of numbers, right? So first I will have to take that maximum value in maybe another CT. So there are various ways of doing it, but let me quickly do it like this because anyways we are using series of CTs over here, so it will be like more simple to understand, right? So I will take the maximum value of the transaction count possible, right? First of all, let me put the from clause. It will be CT underscore temp results, and over here then I will use the transaction count, right? And this will be my max transactions, right? Right? And now what I need to do is now I have to write that recursive CT, right? Where I will make use of this max transaction count. So now I can say CT underscore sequence maybe just to be simple and intuitive, right? Now what I can do is now in a recursive CT, as we know, there are two parts. One is the anchor member, another one is the recursive member. So in the anchor member, since I have to start from zero, I will just say select zero. And then in the recursive part, I will first do a union all, and then in the recursive part, I can just do, and also like I will have to alias this particular column that I'm selecting as zero as something, so I can call it as maybe transactions count, right? Like this. And then I can just say select transactions count plus one from this CT itself, right? So I will be recursively calling this, and whatever is the last addition that I unioned with the existing data of the CT, I will just take that particular value of this particular column and do a plus one, and again union it with the rest of the data, right? And I will keep doing this till my transactions count, right, is actually less than the maximum value from here, right? So what I can do is I can say select from CTE underscore max transactions, and I will be selecting max transactions over here, right? So I'm saying that keep doing this, keep like unioning, every subsequent number with the already existing data in the CTE underscore sequence till this particular condition meets, right? The moment I exceeds my maximum transaction, I don't have to do this. I have to like terminate my sequence over there, right? That's what I'm doing over here. Now, if I just select the results from this particular CT underscore sequence, you will see we will get a series of numbers from 0 till 3, right? Now, you might be understanding what I'm intending to do. I will be just left joining this particular result set, right, with my temp results that we calculated earlier, right? So that was CT underscore temp results, right? And I will be joining it on, of course, my A dot transactions count like this, and B dot transaction count, right? And over here, now I will be selecting whatever I need, right? I need the A dot transaction count, transactions count, and I need the visits count from the B table, which is the temp results, right? Now, if you see this, just check the output. Over here, we have all the transaction counts possible now without any hole, right from 0 till the maximum possible transaction count, right? But wherever, there is actually no visits for a given transaction count, we get null in the visits count, right? So to get rid of this null, we can just use a simple coalesce and coalesce this null to 0, right? And that will give us the final output. I will also have to alias this now to visits count again. And now if I run this, I will get 0 corresponding to the transaction counts where there is no visit, no such visit, right? So that's the solution entirely. I hope you understood. It's a little confusing of a problem to understand the problem itself. But once you know the problem, once you understand the problem statement, it is pretty intuitive and it is pretty direct, right? So I hope you understood all the concepts, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.